Hi there, and welcome to Windows Server 2003 End of Support Migration Overview. My name is Patrick Pusher. I'm a Senior Solution Architect at AppZero. And today we're going to walk you through really the challenge facing us and our whole application estate as Windows Server 2003 wraps up extended support. We're going to walk through the problem. We're going to take a look at an AppZero product demonstration. We're going to learn a little bit about the product and the methodology. And then we're going to wrap up, take a look at the statistics to do with our migrations, and conclude and show you where to get more information around AppZero. So really, the challenge is that about 3/4 of the server estate across the enterprise are Windows servers. And we know that we have at least 10 to 13 million of those in the enterprise in production today. You know, this is the longest server release from Microsoft out in the wild, and so we have a big investment in it. And of course, we have a big investment in the applications underneath it. And so our challenge is to really get the return on investment that we spent configuring, installing, patching, and updating these applications year over year, to really get the most out of that as we migrate those away from Windows Server 2003 to a more supported, efficient, and productive platform. And so, you know, there are a couple ways of doing that. Traditionally, when we talk about application migration, we're used to thinking about terms of moving whole machines, right? A P to V or a V to V or even a virtual to cloud approach. And I think that works well when you're moving sort of like to like, right? If you've got a data center move where you're trying to modernize across the aisle, maybe it's a hardware refresh, I think that works well. Where it doesn't work so well is when you're in a situation like we are now and you've got the sort of the end of support for an OS. So we have to bring those applications somewhere, preferably to a Windows Server 2012 R2. That's where we see most of our customers and our partners' customers migrating applications to, but certainly still a lot of 2008 R2 as well. If we think about that P to V or V to V approach, not only does it really not accomplish modernization, since you are bringing not only the applications but the underlying OS as well, but you really don't get an opportunity to selectively migrate, right? You bring everything that's on that machine. And we know certainly when you're moving maybe across the aisle in a data center, that might be what you want. But as we think about more modern environments, infrastructure as a service, we think about Azure, and we think about starting with a pre-baked image, that's a lot more difficult than, of course, when you think about that P2V approach. As well, you have a lot of data in that approach. If you're really interested in a handful of applications or even one application on that box, but really you have to bring the whole thing, that's a lot more data than if you get application-centric with your move. And so what you're left with is the AppZero approach. Now, regardless of the approach, really there are some key challenges we have with an application migration project. With just about no exceptions, applications that we're going to migrate will experience downtime, and that's really regardless of the approach. You know, there are some real simplified apps that maybe don't fall into that bucket, but certainly most of them do. Another challenge is that we'll have to test our applications on the other side of a migration. Probably one of the biggest ones are compatibility concerns between old applications and new server platforms. And one of the biggest ones we see at AppZero is post-migration, but before you've done the testing on that application, there can be a delta in the data set, right? Because what can happen is you migrate an application to a platform. Of course, but usually that follows a user acceptance testing process. And while that's being done, the application that's maybe running on Windows Server 2003 today gets turned back on to serve user requests. And by the time this application is certified, this one's now got different data. So that point-in-time migration really needs to be refreshed, is what we're saying. And so, you know, that's the case regardless of the technology you're using. So, how does AppZero work, and how does AppZero address some of these challenges? Well, with AppZero, our smallest unit of measure is the application itself. And so if we think about a source server, in this case being Windows Server 2003, having a handful of applications on them, and we have a fresh new target server, we'll call that Windows Server 2012 R2. If we think about this as a two-phase migration with AppZero, the first phase will be done while the application is up and running in production. And so what we really try to do is first, inventory that source server, again, so that you can selectively pick applications rather than have to bring them all. You'll then select which apps you want, of course, out of that complete list. And then we're going to go through with an operation called Pre-populate. And Pre-populate is pretty special in that it we connect to that source server, and we do a few things, but predominantly what we do is we investigate vendor MSIs that are on that server that happen to be cached. If you go to add remove programs or programs and features and you want to do an uninstall, for example, that vendor MSI is cached for that purpose. And so what we do is we go in there and we attempt to learn what the original application vendor intended for installation. We combine that with some select information in the registry that stores install time options, the options that whoever installed the app or whatever installed the app took. So we can combine that and really understand the app footprint. What we then begin to do is to bring over the static pieces of the application that aren't changing while it's in use or locked while it's in use. And that's really important. Before this feature was in the product, you would have to down the application, migrate the whole thing, and then bring it back up. And for an application with a handful of data, that's not such an imposing idea. But with an application that's gigs and gigs or even terabytes of data, that could take a long time. So once pre-populate's done, we come back then into phase 2, where we are going to down the application on the source server. Now that can be done in a maintenance or migration window. We definitely recommend to do that. If your application has no Windows services, it's really kind of a user mode app, then of course that limitation is quite a bit reduced. So in this phase, what we do is the notion of an AppZero virtual application appliance. What we store the application in when you first migrate gets instantiated. We call that a dock. And then we have a bit of a paradigm we follow that sees us starting Windows services first and then running Windows applications after. And usually on server-side applications, those applications are used to manage the services. So that's why we take a sort of service first and then supporting application second. So what you're left with is the application that existed on the source server now exists on the target server as well. It is a copy. It's a read-only operation. We've made no changes on that source server, but through the AppZero extraction and rehosting on the target server, you now have an identical copy of that application. Really, you should say almost identical. There are some things we do in this process that will change your application a little bit, and we'll talk about that. It's really the changes really have to do with the context, the server name, the IP address, the kind of things you can imagine an application might internalize. We'll want to make sure that those are appropriate on the destination server. As you can imagine, with a technology sort of this generalized that can handle really any application, we do have a methodology that wraps around it quite tightly. And this is the sort of methodology that works well for our customers. Now, sometimes if you think about running an application through all these steps, it can seem a bit, the process can seem a bit onerous. And indeed it can, but we tend to think about this, certainly in migration projects at scale, as more of passing waves of applications through this process. And it really teases out enough detail for us to be very successful. I mean, this is the kind of process we follow when we go into a customer's environment that we're not familiar with. Certainly some of this some of these steps can be assumed if this is sort of an internal project and you're using it that way. Otherwise, if you have sort of third parties coming in to help you with your application migration, then this is something they would likely follow as well. So evaluation is really where we talk about the application, judge its candidacy for application with AppZero, and we'll talk a little bit about what make really good fits for AppZero and applications we currently don't support. Then we do a checkpoint where we just make sure that we've got people ready to stand by to support the application who know the application. We'll talk a bit about dependencies in terms of app knowledge in a moment. Then we do a discovery session where we get actually hands on the machines and we verify things we've learned through evaluation and checkpoint. We make sure that we have the account credentials we need, and we pull forward into the validation step, which is really our last opportunity to correct anything, to fill in any of the gaps of missing information we have before we move into our migration window. Validation also makes sure that the destination provision AppZero is installed and licensed properly, and that the two machines can speak to each other networking-wise. And then, of course, we actually execute the migration and the testing. So some of the things that are must-haves with AppZero with the approach, access to account credentials is absolutely important. Two sets, at least two sets are really important. One is local administrator access on the box. That can sometimes be a little bit daunting for customers who are very security conscious. Sometimes they've disabled that account. Sometimes they've renamed it. That's fine. It doesn't have to be named administrator, but we do need access to that during migration. That's an important piece. The second sort of account credential you might need is that if you have Windows services starting as named users, you'll need to bring their passwords to this exercise as well. There's nothing we do that will, surface passwords for accounts or anything like that. You'll have to bring those to the process. Like the account credentials, like the local administrator account credentials that you need, the no AV on the target server is really important as well. So what we do through the process of migration can look malicious to an antivirus platform. We do some injection into executables, and of course, viruses do the same thing. So no AV on the target. We are working to better understand how, with specific antivirus platforms, how we can write exception rules. So the challenge with us is, and you'll see this through the demo, that when you're migrating an application, we don't know ahead of time all the resources we're going to touch, right? So whitelisting things can be really difficult. And lastly, capacity on the target server. This may seem, sort of self-evident, but there's a few AppZero-centric things you have to keep in mind. When you migrate from source server A to target server B, for example, if you're going to what we call dissolve the application, and we'll get into those differences in the demo, you will need the same drive volumes that you had on the source server on the target server. And so that's really important too. It's not just drive capacity, but it's also having the volumes available. If you're not going to dissolve the application, you're going to keep it in the AppZero container, the virtual application appliance. We can virtualize those drive volumes for you. But just know that most of our migrations end in that dissolve, that dissolve process, and we'll talk about why in a moment. But just know that the capacity, of course, the size, and the volumes for drive letters. Now, when we think about a migration project, certainly we see them range from even tens to hundreds to thousands to, believe it or not, tens of thousands of applications. And so what we'll show you today is more of a one-to-one example using our graphical tools. But anything you see me do in a demonstration, we can do at the command line as well. And the theory there is that we bolt our command line utilities to higher level automation frameworks, right? And it's important to know that they're not meant just for that. They can be exercised, of course, by hand at the command line. But the idea is that you can really plug those into something much larger than AppZero that can handle not just the migration, but can handle server provisioning and all sorts of things. So we do have a tool set called Pace, and Pace is used really all throughout the product. It's a standalone utility, but it's also called upon in many different phases of a migration. Pace does a couple things. Firstly, it does an application level inventory across your server estate. Lots of tools do that, but if you don't have one, Pace is really good at that. But sort of following on from that, once you have your application inventory, you can then put check marks beside each application across each server that you want migrated, and really unleash Pace to go and do that in bulk across a number of servers. What you'll see today is that we connect to one server, migrate an app, connect to another server, migrate an app, and we're doing that kind of in a serial fashion. Pace really parallels that process, and if you tell it to go build 100 virtual application appliances, it'll go do that with one command line. So it's really strategic for migration at scale, and we'll talk about sort of Pace in and out of the demo as we go as well. Great segue. We're going to move into our demonstration where we're going to migrate Microsoft Great Plains Dynamics 10 and SQL Server 2005. Okay, so we're here on our target server. This is our Server 2012 instance with AppZero pre-installed. And we're going to open what we call our Tether console. This is our interface expressly built for new migrations. And so we'll take just a quick look at this one. We're going to need a few pieces of information here, pretty basic stuff to get started, where we're going to store our virtual application appliance, the source name of the server, that can be hostname or IP address, and some credentials. And then we're going to get into the inventorying process of that source server. So let's do that. So we're going to call our VAA SQL 2005. For our source name, we're going to use our IP address instead of a host name this time. So I'll paste that there. And some credentials for the server. So we'll do our inventory. And this inventory is the very same thing you'll find under Add Remove Programs or Programs and Features. If your app doesn't show up there, but you're interested in migrating it, we can support you there. We'll talk a little bit about the tabs to the right of our Products tab here in just a minute, where you can manually pick services, and the Launch Application button, where you can manually launch really any executable on the system to be included in the migration. But for now, we're going to pick SQL Server 2005. If this were a production migration, we'd pick all of these products. But in the sake of demo time, we're going to pick the main SQL Server 2005 product. And we're going to click the Start Tether button. So we've really been in phase 1 of our migration, if you remember back to the slides we reviewed earlier. That is where the application is currently up and running. And the intention there is to really get an idea of the application footprint and extract's maybe a bad word, copy the static files to do with the application that aren't going to change before we reach the application migration window where we have to down the application. When you move applications with AppZero, they do have to come down for some period of time. If they're sort of user mode, non-service oriented applications, that's sometimes not true, but just about every server application we do does experience a small amount of downtime. I say small because the idea is that we grab the bulk of the application footprint through this pre-populate operation that we're doing now. And then we come back and we just grab what was locked by the application when it was executing, right? So when we get to the second phase of our migration where we do down the app, it's going to be for a very short period of time because we have most of the application assets already migrated into our virtual application appliance. So that's what we'll be doing. And the idea here is that we can move over to that source server and really look at the Windows installer files that are cached. Those are cached for a couple of reasons, but predominantly if you go to make changes in your application footprint, maybe you want to install a different feature, repair it, uninstall it, the original vendor MISI is important for that. So it is on the server. In most cases, it's on the server. So we can gain some intelligence from the app footprint there in combination with some of the install choices you specified at install time that are saved to the registry. So that information allows us to grab really those files that we can at that time. In the case of a database technology like SQL Server, we'll be able to grab just about everything but the actual database files themselves. There's a few other things that are locked, but not many. In the case of a standard business app, you may be able to grab the whole thing. Right? If it's a static app that doesn't have a changing data set, it could be possible that those files are never locked. So the pre-populate may get every single bit of your application. So as soon as this is done, we'll be moving into the phase where we actually identify the services to do with our application, and AppZero takes a first stab at that, looking through the registry and the relationships between product and services. We'll surface the services that we think have to do with your application. Of course, confirmation is great, and that is really your first opportunity to also add in services that you may want that aren't part of the product but are part of the migration. In a lab, it's real easy to migrate 2 products, but in the wild, we see applications that have been half installed, that have been upgraded, but only one component has, right? So applications look very, very different in the lab than in the wild. And so what we often see is, we intend to start migrating a database tier, but then there's some middleware and there's something else on the server as well that we have to grab. So there's absolutely no need to migrate products separately with AppZero. You can throw everything that's strategic for your migration in one container or one virtual application appliance and migrate it that way. Now, we're not doing that this time for a couple of reasons. One is our SQL Server and our Great Plains box are 2 different machines, right? So to do this the graphical tool way, we have to connect to one, migrate the app, then connect to the other, and migrate the app as well. And that's what we'll be doing. So here at SQL Server, the next one we do will be Great Plains 10. And so as this wraps up, really what we can do is take a look at the file system underneath here and look at what the format of a VAA really is. If we take a quick look here, what AppZero does when you first migrate an app is it containerizes it. If you're familiar with technologies like AppV, you're familiar with the concept of an app bubble and the virtualization a little bit away from the OS and a little bit away from other applications that might conflict. AppZero is similar in some ways and quite a bit different in others, but that encapsulating process is common. So it can be strategic to leave your application in that VAA. Why you might want to do that has to do probably most likely with application conflicts, right? Maybe you've got a server app that has a tie to a specific version of Java, for example, and you've got another with a different but specific tie. Co-locating those on the same host traditionally can be challenging. Doing that with AppZero is pretty straightforward. So that application isolation use case tends to be the one that people value, keeping their application containerized. The flip side of that is a process that we call dissolve, where we take the application assets from the container and we take them out of the container and we push them down to the underlying OS. So instead of seeing an application a folder of application assets that the AppZero runtime reads and interprets and presents to Windows, Instead, we actually take these assets, and you can see here, for example, every file that we record from the C drive of the source server gets stored here in the csourced directory of the VAA. So you can see very, very common sort of file structure, something that you would see from the root of C, for example. And in fact, when you do a dissolve, that's exactly what happens. We push these files right here down to the root of the C drive. And in fact, if there were other drive volumes, you'd see those here too. You'd see C store C, C store D, E, and so on. So in this case, it's really only application information coming from drive C, but if you had more, you'd have more. And so this is how, in the first stage of a migration, we can virtualize those drive volumes for you, since they're really only in the context of the VAA. And so that decision will be yours at the end of migration. Keep virtualized or dissolve. The dissolve tends to be the more popular option, and there's probably a couple reasons for that. One is app supportability, right? If you keep your app inside this AppZero container, for example, and you need a third party to come in and support your application, there can often be questions around the app virtualization layer if the problem is sort of, originating from there, originating from the application. So the dissolve process really breaks that paradigm all up. No longer is your application virtualized, and in fact, you can uninstall AppZero after you dissolve. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So we have a note on the screen here that says not all services are stopped. And what that means is we've detected that on the source server, SQL Server is still running. We're now moving into phase 2, so we've pre-populated. We've grabbed a lot of application data already. And in fact, if we just take a look at the size of our appliance, so far our application is almost a gig. And so a base SQL installation without a lot of data is about somewhere around 2 gig, I think. So we're almost halfway there with pre-populate already. So we don't want to continue docking at this stage. We're going to say no. And we're going to take a look at what services are running on that source server. We could RDP into that box, and in fact I am in the background if we need to get there. But we really aim to give you everything you need in the AppZero interface to be able to really maneuver your way through a migration. So you can see here, if we right-click on any of these services, we can click Stop Remote Service. And this will effectively stop SQL on our source server. So we're going to do that. We're going to stop each of these. Only the ones that are selected. You'll notice that AppZero selected these services based on our product selection. And in fact, it got it right. So the services with checkbox are the ones we want to make sure are stopped. So we only have one more, and that's this one here. So we'll stop them all. Before we click the Start Tether button and move on with the process, we should talk probably about this Remote Accounts tab. This is support for migrating user accounts along with your applications. You can see here that we have several SQL Server groups. And when an app installs accounts or groups, it's really strategic to include those in the migration. But you could find a case where you've done some strategic security around the file system of your application. Maybe you've got some folders that are open for more users than others. We will certainly handle the migration of users. If they're local users, we will move the username, the SID, the home folder, everything you would expect to move with a user. If they're domain users, then they won't show up in this list, but domain users are still important in this process, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. So we've got all our SQL Server groups selected, which is great. That's really all we need. And we're going to go ahead and now click the Start Tether button. Now what this is going to do is it's going to create this full-time connection between this target server and our source server. So we're going to click that, and it may look like we're going to re-pre-populate, but we're not. We're just going to do a quick check whether we've completed that operation or not. It takes a couple seconds, and then we're going to do what's called a dock of the virtual application appliance. Now the dock is really readying an AppZero VAA to either run or to first-time migrate. And so as that docks, what's left to do with the migration is to next start these services here on this target server. There's sometimes a misconception that AppZero analyzes things running on the source server, and in fact that's not the case. Truly, we're not that interested in how the app runs on server 2003. It's going to run a fair bit different on server 2012, so we want to analyze it here. It's hard to do before the application's here, though. So what we do is we create an IPC share, and we remotely execute the main binaries behind each service. As we do that, we watch them very tightly for resources that they're reaching out and interacting with. If you've ever used a tool like Process Explorer, you're familiar with how much information you can get from watching a binaries execution. And we do something very similar. So every time an application makes a call to something, we make sure that we either got that in the VAA already from our pre-populate operation we did earlier. If we don't, we're going to cross this, what we call tether bridge, to the source server and retrieve that component. If it's a DLL, maybe it's a configuration file, maybe it's even another binary. We're going to retrieve that, we're going to bring it over to the target server and install it here. So you can see here now that our doc is finished, and now we've got not a whole list of services like we did before, but now we've got just the services we picked. So what's left to do here is we're going to right-click and start each one. But before I do, I want to draw your attention down here to the system, to the sys-tray area here. We've got an AppZero icon. We call that our tether monitor. That icon will spin as there's data flowing from the source server to the target server. And it gives you lots of sort of real-time information around where we are, what phase we are in the migration, what we're currently handling, whether it's a bunch of files, a bunch of registry keys, or maybe even another component like a Windows side-by-side assembly, for example. So I'm going to right-click the service, I'm going to click Start, but I want you to watch that tether icon in the bottom right-hand tray. It'll begin to spin. Now, because we've done pre-populate, it won't actually spin that much. If you're interested in trying this, if you forego the pre-populate option, and you try to migrate an application all inside of this sort of tether context, it'll take a lot longer. And that's because we're not starting with any data, we're starting with absolutely nothing. So we can see here our first Windows service has started. That's great. That's the desired end state of this portion of the migration, is to get all of our services started. So we're going to keep moseying down the list and starting each one. We won't start the disabled ones, obviously, but we will start the ones that sort of require it. So if I hover over our tether monitor here, you'll see, as soon as our system comes back, that we get some information around how much we've migrated, so far. So if we hover over here, if you hover over here, it tells us we've tethered 1 meg, which seems like not a lot, but when you think that we've started with almost 1 gig already, it is a fair bit. And really what that 1 or now 3 gig is mostly is probably active registry content, right? It's probably not completely true, but we find that when we grab the static content and then we combine it with analysis of the running application, we tend to pick up a lot of the registry content on that run. And so we'll continue down, starting these services. I think these last two. A phenomenon you'll probably experience is that as you begin to move down the list, you fulfill more and more dependencies. So the services, as long as they're all relatively the same in sort of size and scope, the services towards the end of the list will probably start a little bit faster than the services towards the start. And so there we go. We've got all of our SQL services started and running. But of course, SQL is more than just Windows services, as we talked about earlier. So we really want to look at the applications that support these as well. You can get to them in a number of ways. You can click the Launch Application button, and this will give you a Start Menu-esque sort of interface that is sequestered down to only the products you pick, not all the Start Menu items on the server. So you can see here that we could navigate down to SQL Server and really pick any of these. We want to really launch SQL Management Studio. We want to launch all of these if we were doing this in production, but certainly for our purposes, we want to at least launch Management Studio. You can do it from here, or if you visit sort of the Start Menu equivalent in Server 2012, you can see that we've brought these icons over, and we've put little AppZero icons in the bottom right quadrant just to remind you that this app is virtualized and running as a VAA. When we do the dissolve process, you'll see that the little AppZero icons in the bottom right go away. They become the native icons of the application. So let's click our Management Studio. And what you'll find is, just like the services, we're going to see our little tether monitor spin in the system tray as we bring the dependencies for this application over from the source server. This will take quite a bit of time, depending on how big the application is. Server Management Studio is large, so you'll see it sort of reconstitute in real time, and it takes a bit of time. It's very normal to see application not responding. Have some patience. You can imagine if we start with the main binary of an app, but every time that application needs something and it's used to getting it locally at local file system speeds, we have to traverse a network bridge to get. It's going to take some time, so it does take a little bit longer. And I'll minimize this AppZero piece just for a moment, make our screen a little less busy. And so what you can see here is we now have our application up, and so we want to change this not to be SQL host from let me close this window behind me. Not to be SQL host, which is the host name of our old SQL server, but instead the host name of our new one. So we're going to change this to and connect. And so really what we're doing is we're interacting with those newly migrated SQL services on the box. And here we can see indeed that our host name is represented properly, and away we go. We can see our databases here, and in fact, this is the database we're especially interested in to do with Great Plains Dynamics 10. Now, one of the things we didn't talk about very much was how an application moves from source server to target server, and some of the values that it's internalized to do with server name IP address get changed, because of course they have to. If an application thinks it's installed on server name A but is executing on server name B, that's probably not so good from a consistency perspective. So what we do as we move an app from server A to server B is we employ a feature called config on the fly. And config on the fly watches the data stream and replaces those values like server names, IP addresses, even MAC addresses in virtual environments where it's strategic. We will watch that data flow and we'll change those values to values that make sense on the target server, right? So in this case, the name of the machine. So that's why, and we'll watch registry content. We'll watch anything that's machine readable, really. A configuration file that's machine readable, we'll go in and we'll handle as well. So that's great. We've got our SQL services migrated. We've got our SQL Server Management Studio up and running. We would likely launch all of those SQL products and management utilities, unless you had a specific reason not to, before you concluded your migration. For our purposes today, we won't do that. We'll click Finish Tether, and ultimately what will happen now is this VAA will undock, so it will be not in a ready-to-run state, and then we'll have some choices of what we want to do with it. I think for our purposes, what we'll do today is, to show you dissolve, we'll dissolve SQL Server down to the underlying OS, and then we'll migrate the Great Plains Dynamics 10 tier to this machine, where we'll have one native app migrated with AppZero, but is no longer encapsulated in a container, and one that is. So to do that, we are going to use the command line interface here and run the AppZero dissolve command. But before I do that, one of the best practices is to open up the administrative console, which is more of a power user utility than the Tether console we were using earlier. You can power new migrations with this utility, but it's meant to also go in and do what we're doing here, edit them, change them, that sort of thing. So we've got our application here, but once we do a dissolve, we will not be able to run this application virtualized anymore. And why that is that we'll have application services in the underlying OS, plus we'll have application services in our container that are the same name, and that's a no-no. So what we're going to do here is actually compress this VAA for an exercise that we'll do a little bit later. So compressing a VAA will take everything we looked at in that application's virtual application folder, and we looked at that here. Compressing it will take all of this information and put it in a single file that you can then take and move to any additional server running AppZero and run your app. No need to remigrate it. And so we're going to look at that in just a moment as well. So as that compresses, it's a fairly big application, so this may take a few seconds to compress. What we'll do next is really dissolve it down to the underlying OS. But what I want to show you just before we do that, now that you know kind of what a VAA is, what it looks like from a file system perspective, how AppZero handles it, and especially now that you know you can compress it down to a file, let's have a quick look at something I did last night, and that was run this migration, but copy the resulting VAA up to a Microsoft Azure instance. That's really as easy as it is in terms of migrating an application from source A to a staging or intermediate server like we're doing here, and then moving your migrated VAA over to its final destination. That's a popular strategy when you're migrating over links that are really not under your control. Maybe it's the public internet, maybe it's a traffic-shaped WAN, something that can really change performance. We recommend you migrate to a machine that's close to you from a LAN perspective, and then take the resulting VAA like I did, and move it to the sort of final resting place of the application, its final destination. So here you can see our VAA is compressed. Let's have a quick look at how big that is. So this VAA, when we're fully done with it, is about 1.65 gig, and the compressed version here is half a gig, so you can see it's substantial. So as I mentioned, I took that over to Azure, and we'll get to running that in just a minute, but we can delete this. That was just for display purposes. But our VAA now is ready to be dissolved. So let's move over and do that. We navigate to the AppZero application folder, and we run a command called appzdissolve. And what that does is it analyzes the VAA, and again takes the contents of it and pushes it down to the underlying OS. So let me actually call this out, and then I'll just zoom in a bit to the actual string so you can see it. That's our VAA. And so if we just take a quick look at that, it's really just the appz dissolve command with the VAA as an argument. And there's a few optional arguments there, but you really don't need them. This will be all we need. So let's run that. The VAA does have to be undocked, and that probably makes sense why that is. So what you'll see is kind of a status of each Windows component as we go, right? So you can see here that we've got account bundles. So when we chose our user groups in the user pane of AppZero, we chose a bunch of groups to be migrated with SQL, and we can see that that's what's happening. And then we're just going to move down over the different categories of resources, whether they're files or Windows side-by-side assemblies, registry keys, and one by one for each different kind of resource, just dissolve them down to the underlying OS. When we're done, the best practice is definitely to reboot the server so that your services can come up and you can work with it, and we'll do that as well. So when we do, after we're done dissolving and we reboot, we'll take a look at that Azure instance and see how we can use a pre-prepared virtual application appliance across many different hosts, if that's kind of our intention. So as this dissolves, we can see here we're at 8 or 9%. This is like a lot of progress bars. You'll see it go from 10 to 12 to done, just because there's kind of a lot of information in a VAA, and the different components take different times to register as well. So it's pretty difficult to predict, but we do try. So when we're done, again, we're going to have to reboot this host. Let's move off while this wraps up, though, and take a look at our Azure instance. So this is it here, and again, I've pre-installed AppZero. That's really important to use a VAA that's been created elsewhere. Even if you want to dissolve it, the AppZero software has to be here at least initially. And so if we take a look, I think it's in downloads here. Yeah, it is. So if we take a look, these are the two VAAs that we're going to create in our demo today. We've just created SQL 2005, and we're about to create Great Plains 10. So it's this VAA that I file transferred up here. All I did was take the .cap file that I compressed, as you saw me just do. And what I want to do is move this into the appliances folder. And if I do that, the administrative console will all of a sudden see it. And now we can do an uncompress. While that goes, you guessed it, we'll move back to our last machine. And good timing, our dissolve is done. So you get a bit of a dissolve report, tells you how many files, how many registry keys, all sorts of good information around the process and kind of the payload of the application that we're dealing with. So now that we're done this, what we're going to do is close out and reboot our host. And we'll return to our Azure instance where we're uncompressing. Now, there's a key piece after we uncompress, but before we can run the app. And that is config on the fly. We talked about config on the fly, how it works through the duration of a migration. It's sort of inherent in the process. But config on the fly is also available to be run anytime you do what we call a rehost of the application. So config on the fly, let me just bring it up here, is this window here. And what this is all about is, again, watching that data stream when you're migrating and replacing values that have to do with the environment you're in now. Now that we're rehosting, it's a little bit different. We're going to have to change the argument towards config on the fly not to be the original host name, but the host name of the machine we last migrated to, because of course we ran it there as well. So there will be no more occurrences of SQL host as a server name on our already migrated app, the one that we prepared this VAA against, but there will be occurrences of our intermediate server name, which is Windows 2K12 DST. So that's how we're going to run it. We'll click OK. And what we're going to do is just parse through all those application assets, just like we did at time of migration, and make sure we handle the substitution of the server name to the correct server name that is this machine here. And this will take, depending on the size of your application, this can take anywhere from seconds to several minutes. So as that goes, we will connect back to our local 2012 machine. Where we've rebooted. And as promised, now we have the SQL Server icons without the little AppZero icon on the bottom right, signifying that these are natively installed. And we could click any of these. SQL Server Configuration Manager, for example, we'll click because we did on our first go-round. We can close that up. I might have hit the wrong icon. I did. We'll hit Management Studio. Here you can see it launches considerably faster, and that's because the app's here, the app's dissolved, but even if we had tried to run this in the VAA a second time, it would run this fast, since all the resources are now local, right? We did a first-time run, and with that, our resources are local, so that the app comes up, as quick as you would expect it to natively. So again, we just connect to our source server, connect to our databases, make sure this works like it did in our run-through while the app was virtualized, and away we go. So that's SQL Server migrated and done with. What we have left to do then is Great Plains Dynamics 10. So let's do that. Let's grab the IP address of that host, which is a little bit different. And we're going to run Tether console once again. So this time we're going to create a VAA called Great Plains 10. And we'll specify again our IP address and credentials for that server. And we'll do an inventory. So here we will pick Great Plains 10. We'll pick the SQL Server native client, although we probably don't need it since we have SQL Server on the box. We'll pick it anyways. And then we'll click the Start Tether button again. The very same thing will happen. We are going to pre-populate. With Dynamics Great Plains 10, it's questionable whether you'd want to do this, right? There's certainly nothing wrong with it, but the pre-populate option really is to end around having to have the application down for such a long time. And why that is because we have to turn those Windows services off. With this application, there actually is no service footprint, right? So strictly speaking, it's not necessary, but still a good practice. It does combine intelligence around the sort of Windows installer, which gives AppZero a little more context of the application. So it's always a good idea, but not strictly necessary in this example. So as we pre-populate, again, what's going to happen, we're going to grab as much information around the static files as possible, bring them over, and we'll complement that with a real-time runtime analysis of the application. Just like SQL Server. We can see here now that we've started pulling application information over. Probably not a whole lot yet. Let's have a look at how big our VAA is. Yeah, so it's really just started. It's 20 meg. But that pre-populate option will fill it full of information. And you'll see that really the amount of top-off we have to do, that is the fill-in we do through the analysis portion of the migration, is very, very small. So let's have a quick look then at our Azure instance again as this completes. And our application config on the fly is done, and our application is ready to be docked and run. So we're going to do that. We're going to dock this. We're going to move over to services. And just like you saw us do on the other host, we're going to start these up. Now these, of course, this machine now is not connected to anything. It's no longer what we call tethered. So these will all start up just as you'd expect them to do. Just as what I explained before, where once you've already got all the application assets in the VAA, performance is near native, and you really should expect that. So we'll just start these last two services. And we'll do the very same operation we did on our local VM. That is just launch the management console, or management studio rather. I'm just taking a look at the applications here. There we are. Let's have a look at this one. And again, SQL Server Management Studio should launch a fair bit faster since we're not pulling anything from those servers anymore. And, geez, I don't remember this server name, so, oh, there it is right there. Boy, that's a mouthful. Let's connect there. And away you go. So the very same VAA that we once migrated to a Windows 2002 non-R2 host has been brought to Windows Server 2012 R2 and run successfully here. And remember, we don't have to remigrate. So what customers find value in taking an application, migrating it, maybe creating a copy for dev test, a copy for production, and a copy for whatever else they have, potentially QA. So very easy. One migration can really be rolled out to many servers. And better yet, the licensing model for AppZero supports that at no extra cost. So that's as easy as it is reusing a VAA. Let's undock this and let's move away back to our local VM. So we move over to the services side, and now you see nothing because, of course, the applications we pick don't have really service components. So nor do they have really account dependencies. So we can click this Finish Tether button, but what we want to probably do is launch the application. So we're going to click this Launch Application, navigate to Great Plains 10, and just choose Great Plains. Now, before we do that, something that's a little important. When this was on the original server, it was pointing to SQL host as the host name to find its SQL Server. Well, now we've changed that. SQL host no longer exists. It does, but we've turned SQL off. And we've migrated to our 2012 host. So we're going to have to do some ODBC maintenance here to make this work. So we can run it. You saw the little tether monitor spin. It's going to continue to spin as we load our application up. I'll minimize AppZero out of here so we can see. And we have a login. So great. We do have to do our ODBC maintenance before this will work, so I'll cancel out of this. Here you see a not responding, which is pretty standard as we reconstitute the app, right? And I think we've actually got a hidden, yeah, there it is, login dialog box. So this won't work. It's pointing to the wrong SQL Server. So let's adjust that real quick. And it's a great example to show you how you get into the context of a VAA. This may seem counterintuitive, but other applications from the outside of a container can't see inside by default. And so when you do application patching or changes, you have to do it in a bit of an AppZero-centric way when it's virtualized like this. And so we're going to call up an AppZero command prompt. And what this really is about is it's a hybrid view of the file system of your source server and your target server. And that's really necessary when you think about it, since you want to be launching applications that aren't physically installed in this box yet, but that are tethered over on the source server. So for us, what we want to do is run the ODBC configuration utility to make the change we need to. And so we can do that. So we'll see here that we now have a 32-bit and a 64-bit ODBC source. So we'll change the 32-bit here. And this is really the field we want to change, is this pointer to the old SQL host. You can see here that it's pointing to the old one, as you would expect it to. And we simply have to repoint it to where we want to point for our database. So in our case, it's actually this very machine. So I suppose we could use localhost, but for our purposes, we'll use the host name. And we'll supply some credentials here. We'll leave the default database the way it is, leave the rest of the things the way it is, and away we go. Okay, and now we can relaunch that Great Plains front-end application. And again, we can do it this way, or we can visit the Start menu equivalent and do it that way. We'll see the icons there, but let's do it this way this time. Because we ran it once, some of the application assets will be here. We didn't fully use the application, we didn't log in, but you'll see that the application comes up. And now, when we log in, just wait a moment. There we go. When we log in, we'll see the application function, hopefully. There we go. So it's pulling from our SQL database that was previously migrated and dissolved on this host. And now we've got the Great Plains 10 front-end application in a VAA. So we've got a bit of both. We've got an application we've migrated and dissolved, and an application we're running in that virtual application appliance containerized mode. And so now really it's not necessary to go down and pull down every option in an application so that we understand it. We do a lot of things. We make a lot of assumptions around app footprints. We're always on the conservative side. So we do gather a lot of information around your application. So don't pull down every window menu, but log into your app as you saw me do here. If there are separate pieces of your application, like reporting modules, run those, launch them. You don't have to go into them in any great detail, but at least call them out. We like to say, run, exercise all of the entry points or shortcuts into your application, right? As you heard me talk about many times, we would have ran all the SQL utilities had this been a production migration, but we have some time constraints here. So that's it. That's Microsoft Great Plains Dynamics 10. So when we're done, we close our application. You can see our finish tether buttons grayed out for a little bit, and then when our application finally ends, we have finish tether here again. So we'll click that, and now we're left with a VAA. Again, simply a directory on the file system with all of our information that we grabbed. You can see here, if we go in, you can see that we grabbed, as you'd imagine, all the Great Plains data. And a little bit more. You can always prune and clean from your VM if you'd like, but really it's mostly around the application footprint and what the application touches as it executes. It's not always really straightforward, what an application, if there's dependencies from apps to apps, taking a quick look inside your folder will often lead you to a better understanding of the different pieces of your applications and how they correlate, because we'll find them through the application's execution path. That's it for the demo. We'll pivot back here to our presentation and just take a look at what we did go over and what we accomplished. So we migrated SQL Server 2005 and Dynamics Great Plains 10. And we migrated those from 2 separate hosts to 1 common host. So a bit of a re-architecture there. We find that when people move from data centers to clouds especially, they sometimes like to take that opportunity to do some of that, simply because they may have right-sized their application at the point in time that they installed it, but maybe they've outgrown it, or maybe moving to a cloud environment, they want to be able to right-size the database exclusively and then right-size the Dynamics tier as well, right? If this is the reverse and they were on 1 host and we split them out to 2, that's an often popular move when we move to a cloud environment. But from this perspective, we kind of went in the reverse, where we took 2 separate tiers of an application and we sort of co-located those on 1 host. And as you can see, we migrated, about 2.5 gig worth of data, and lots of files and registry keys and Windows subcomponents, in fact. Not only that, we took the resulting VAA from our SQL migration and we file transferred that up, really in any means you can, to an Windows 2012 R2 Azure instance and ran it there as well. So it does illustrate that you can take a VAA that's prepared on 1 machine, run it on another with no remigration. If you're looking for more information on AppZero, we have great resources. If you look at appzero.com/field-engineering/resources, there's lots and lots of good info there. We have a best practices deck. We have other resources, and I think the one that's probably the most value is the migration readiness checklist. So that will call out everything you need to think about in order to be prepared for your migration. Some of the things we talked about today, access to account credentials, making sure you have a test plan, making sure there is not antivirus on your staged or intermediate migration machine. Really, certainly all the big ones we called out here, but there'll also be some other smaller considerations to check in that documentation. And then we have many more videos around application migration examples, including the one you saw here, something very similar. We have IIS migration examples. We do support the migration of IIS in an up-level scenario. So we have those on the web, as well as lots of different sort of combinations and permutations of demos. With that, thanks very much for your time, and we hope you learn more about AppZero.